So, yeah, I really appreciate that you found time with me today to speak about something that we are both interested in, and that is like fueling performance for especially endurance athletes, but for athletic population in general. And I hope that we can in some way clear that topic for many people when it comes to like fueling during the workout specifically, and enhance and improve recovery after the workouts. So can you introduce yourself actually for the people who don't know you from Instagram or from anywhere else?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invitation, first of all. So, my name is Tim. I'm originally from Slovenia, but I did my PhD in the UK. I'm currently a pretty busy person. So, my main job is being an assistant professor in exercise physiology at the University of Primorska here in Slovenia. But I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at one of the institutes here in the field of environmental physiology and exercise metabolism. And apart from that, I also work in the Human Performance Center in Slovenia. This is a new startup that I have with a few friends of mine, where we test athletes, do like physiological testing, and also like sports nutrition consulting and coaching. So we work from like novice amateur athletes all the way up to the professional athletes. And the fourth thing that I currently work on is also like help build a new sports nutrition brand called Endurance, which is kind of the aim is to provide athletes with the most like scientific based products, especially like fueling for endurance athletes. So during exercise and then recovery. So this is the topic we're actually going to discuss today. So yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, that's all exciting stuff. And actually, I had one of the previous episodes with your colleague, which was Tina,
Yeah.
also from the Human Performance Center. So I'm happy to have you guys here. And also, she was actually the one who recommended me to speak with you on this topic.
Cool.
So that's like perfectly. I mean, it's amazing, and especially because you also work in the lab. You see things that might not be seen uh, from outside, right? So you see what's happening inside of the body, and you are constantly testing these things. And as I've seen, you are doing muscle biopsies and this exciting stuff. So, just to start with, I think let's bring people into the picture because, as you said, there are like different levels of athletes, and I also work with athletes who are just maybe starting. They are very active, but they don't necessarily need to go to Tour de France. And this is probably not our audience here. This is for people who really have like some competition aspirations. They want to win. They want to get better and better, but they are not expecting to win the Tour de France or anything similar. So what is actually the idea behind fueling yourself during exercise, or when one should start thinking about fueling during the exercise? Because if you go out for I don't know, like 2 kilometers run or even 5K run, you probably don't need to consider fueling during that time.
So yeah, it's a really good question, and sometimes we think that like only elite athletes need to fuel during exercise, and that like amateur and novice athletes, they don't need to fuel because they don't expend as much energy, which is kind of true to a certain degree, but it's kind of interesting to look from another perspective, which is how much time do we need to actually deplete muscles of glycogen. So In research, we often do muscle glycogen depletion sessions. So these are like high intensity interval sessions. So people are doing intervals for as long as they can. And at the end of those exercise bouts, we sometimes or usually do muscle biopsies so that we make sure that like glycogen is really depleted so that we can quantify it. And one of the funny things is that most of the time, so the average time to do those sessions doesn't really vary between elite athletes and like amateur level athletes. So it always takes around, like, let's say 2 hours plus minus half an hour to deplete muscle glycogen content. The difference between elite and novice athletes is mostly in the exercise intensity during those sessions, so the relative intensity. But overall, we can clearly see that like the more trained you are, this means that you expend more energy because you're pushing harder. But for the same effort, you probably need to start fueling at the same time. So if you have like a training session, a high intensity training session, it doesn't really matter if you're an elite or an amateur, you need to support this training with some more carbohydrates. Then the amount of carbohydrates during the training session and before the training session, this one depends on the type of athlete you are.
Yeah, and I really think that you brought a good points here. One was the training status of the person, how well trained they are, and the time it takes. So basically, for the same time, we have this 2 hours plus minus half an hour, but the intensity is different, or probably the elite athlete can push harder. So basically, that would mean covering more distance in that time. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. So, for example, like I'm more like close to cycling. So, for instance, one can be exercising at like 300 watts, and at the same time be using like 4 grams or even more than 4 grams of carbohydrates per hour, whereas somebody that would be doing like, I don't know, half of the wattage would only be using like half of those 4 grams, so 2 grams per hour, which means that like the overall energy expenditure and those energy requirements for the session would be much lower in a less trained athlete, but still like carbohydrates during exercise would be beneficial. Also, like another point to add here is that with training, as you get more trained, your muscles' capacity to store glycogen improves. So if we took biopsies and quantified the concentration of glycogen in the muscle of trained athletes or untrained, we would see like a huge difference up to like in trained athletes, it can be like twice the amount of glycogen in the muscles as compared to non-trained athletes.
So when we take that question, like when should an athlete start thinking about fueling for their workouts? Like, let's say you start running or cycling, and let's go by time, I guess. So you normally run or cycle bike for what, let's say for an hour, and then as you are improving, you start to do longer sessions, not necessarily more intense, although intensity is also variable here, but let's say moderate intensity. And should you start fueling like if the exercise takes 1 hour, or after 1 hour, or when would you suppose that time would be for the person to get like some beneficial adaptations or to get better workout?
So this is a really, really tough question and a really complex one. So I really like to take this session from a like to take a look from a bigger picture. So do a step backwards and see what the next training session is going to be like, what the previous training session was like, what are the goals of the training session. So, for instance, if this training session is, let's say, it's 1 hour long, it's very intense or really, really hard intervals, and then the next session is the next day and it's still pretty intense, then I would probably say, yeah, have some carbohydrates even in this like relatively short session. But if this is like a real low intensity session, like steady state run or a bike ride, then I would say no, you don't need. Yeah, you wouldn't. I would probably say just take carbohydrates if you're feeling fatigued. Otherwise, go without, because it's kind of known for quite a while that high carbohydrate availability around and during training sessions that are of low intensity can have a negative impact on the adaptations from the training session. So you sometimes want kind of restrict carbohydrate availability. But then restricting carbohydrate availability means a longer recovery time, which you also need to take into account, because you still need to be able to execute the subsequent training sessions. So this is really, really complex. But as a rule of thumb, I would probably say like everything that's longer than 2 hours, carbohydrates are necessary. If the session is shorter than 2 hours, if it's low intensity, so zone 1 to zone 2, you have carbohydrates if you're fatigued or if your next session is of high intensity. But on the other hand, yeah, you do it. You can do it without carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. So here is actually my approach to this, and maybe you can comment on that. But actually, this question came from runners who are just like starting. So before they were running less than 10 kilometers at a time, now they are starting to extend beyond that 10 kilometers. So their time is about 1 hour, so relatively slow runners, right? And as a rule of thumb, like you mentioned, with runners specifically, I would suggest like after that 1 hour you should start thinking about like maybe drinking at least water, and start to get some carbs in, like you mentioned. Not a lot of, but some, maybe 15 grams of carbohydrates after that 1 hour period.
Yeah, this sounds like a plan. I mean, yeah, I always look from the perspective of cyclists because I mostly work with them, but the volume of running is usually a bit lower than in cyclists, so this kind of makes sense. And also like the impact, the stress on the body is higher during running, so this period, this window, like the duration of 2 hours, can go to 1 hour. And also like one of the things that we kind of sometimes forget is the fact that carbohydrates can improve the perception of, like, reduce the perception of effort and improve performance, even when carbohydrates in the form of glycogen are not limited in the body. So just feeling that you have some carbohydrates improves performance, basically.
Oh yeah, it can definitely refresh you in that way. So that's one thing. So we have, well, let's say 1 hour for runners or a running session, for bikes or cycling where you don't have as much impact, and well, actually are burning also probably less calories than for the same time of running. Then for the cycling it would extend to about 2 hours, so twice as much when it comes to time.
Yeah,
I think this is like a general recommendation.
makes sense.
Okay, so we have this, and we also mentioned that there is a difference like in how high intensity the training is. That obviously, like, for if you are running intervals, then you might benefit from having those carbohydrates maybe during the session, just to improve performance and maybe feel better. Another one thing that I would consider beyond the time and intensity, I would say that I see people that they get really hungry after those rides. So having those carbohydrates, like really small amount during the activity, actually prevents them from having the like overeating afterwards. So have you noticed anything like that?
Oh yeah, I think this is like a really common thing, and it happens to me as well. So whenever I try to do a session, like a few hours without carbohydrates, and I feel like okay on the bike, for instance, and I say, yeah, I'm strong, I can do it without carbs. But then when I get home, I just have like a huge a lot of hunger, and I just need to eat everything I see. What basically happens is that during exercise, um, liver glycogen stores get really low, and as a result of that, you might actually feel towards the end of such a training session that you're a bit hypoglycemic, so you're almost like hitting the wall. But even if that doesn't occur, your liver glycogen stores are really low. And this is a signal for the body that you need food, you need energy. So you basically are hungry after the exercise, and then you just eat shitloads of food and everything you see. And yeah, that's not ideal.
Yeah, right. So because this is what I usually see in runners, like how they gain weight while they are training for marathon because they don't feel properly during or before the exercise. Then they get really hungry and they think like, ah, okay, I burned so many calories, now I can eat whatever and just listen to my hunger, and that leads them down that road of gaining weight that they didn't want to.
Yeah, that's pretty common, I think, and I basically like most people are struggling with this because they think, yeah, I burned a lot of food and I haven't eaten anything during the ride. Now I can actually eat, but that's not how it works, basically.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you can be also hindering your recovery afterwards.
Yeah. So yeah, basically when you become when your liver glycogen stores get depleted during exercise and your blood sugar levels start to decline, that's when you start utilizing protein as a source of energy to actually build up the glucose and to maintain the blood glucose levels. And this is when this damage occurs to the muscles. And yeah, that can be
Mhm.
a that can lead to problems and yeah, delayed recovery.
Right, but you just gave me an idea that there are these low carb promoters who say like, I want to get fat adapted and I will just run on fat, so I will not eat carbohydrates even like during the activity, and maybe just eat fat. I don't know, MCT oil or I don't know, chia seeds or whatever. But basically keeping it low carb outside of exercise, keeping the steady energy during the exercise. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, so like this thing of carbohydrate periodization is of big interest to me, and I think most people get it wrong because it's kind of an idea that you want to like really really push the fat oxidation rates and like limit the carbohydrate availability. And during my PhD, actually one of the studies I did was focused on that. So the current understanding of this like low glycogen training and low carbohydrate availability training is that you do a high intensity interval training session after which you don't eat anything that contains carbohydrates or very little carbohydrates. So you may mainly focus on your nutrition on protein and perhaps fat, and then you start the next training session. And at that time, you will probably have your muscle glycogen stores very low. Your liver glycogen stores will be very low. And if we measure fat oxidation rates during such a session, fat oxidation rates would obviously be very high because basically there is no carbohydrates to be used. But the problem with those sessions is that they can be really short. If you make them really long or longer than like an hour, they become really hard for people, and the recovery time is going to be like tremendously long. And one of the things that kind of I wanted to experiment was what would have happened had athletes received some carbohydrates during such a glycogen depleted ride. So, for example, you start the ride without a breakfast, and you have avoided eating carbohydrates after the session the previous day. So the next morning, you start the exercise session, you go for a run, and only after like half an hour of an activity, you start to ingest carbohydrates. And we found out that you do not suppress fat oxidation rates if you introduce carbohydrates with 30-minute delay. So basically, you're still using a lot of fat, but what you do achieve is you maintain glucose levels in the bloodstream, which probably means that you are doing less damage to your body, which can actually be very beneficial, especially if you take into account the recovery process.
I actually used to do that strategy like when I started, but I did not even know about like physiology of it.
Yeah, it's kind
or
of
benefits or whatever.
I heard about this strategy actually, to be honest, from Chris Froome's book like years ago. And I started thinking, what does this mean in terms of physiology? And then, I was looking for papers on that, and there wasn't much about that. So I started looking into that from the scientific perspective.
But I guess what you just mentioned, it was in athletes that are like not on a low carb diet overall, right? This was like only like train low protocol.
Yeah, exactly. So these were athletes, like normal people, VO2 max, I think around 58 on average. So like moderately trained, probably doing like 8 to 12 hours of training per week at most. And they were like habitually adapted to a high carbohydrate diet. And one of the things that really was also interesting to me was that we have three different conditions. So on one condition, they got a lot of carbohydrates before this second training session. And on two conditions, they didn't have any carbs. They started the session fasted. On one occasion, they got carbohydrates during, like with a 30-minute delay. And on the other occasion, they didn't get anything at all until the end. And what was interesting was how big of a difference in fat oxidation rates just restricting carbohydrate intake made. So for instance, when you take a look at when you have a look at fat max of normal people, you probably see a value of like 0.5, 0.6 grams per minute. So this is the maximum amount of fat people can use after an overnight fast. Whereas in this study, those people stripped of muscle and liver glycogen were able to, without any difficulties, utilize in excess of 1 gram per minute of fat, which is like almost as much as low carb adapted athletes. So just like one night without carbohydrates made such a big difference.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never seen that.
Yeah,
so basically you can.
We were really surprised to see
Sorry.
this.
So basically you can benefit from like, let's say, low carb adaptation without really being low carb all the time.
Yeah, that's the point of like carbohydrate periodization. Those sessions were really hard. Like I had like troubles sleeping. I usually have trouble sleeping when my glycogen stores are low. But as a training strategy or nutritional strategy, better to say, this is a viable and a really good option.
Well, what is anyway the reason to do that kind of sessions?
So that's a good one. So I never do such sessions with elite athletes. So, for example, I work with cyclists they have all the time they want for training. So they can do like 20 hours a week. They can do 30 hours a week if necessary. But then you have athletes like myself that we don't have the time all the time available. So we are restricted to like training, like let's say 10 hours a week. So at certain point, if you want to get better, you need to increase the training volume. And utilizing such an approach, for example, like restricting carbohydrates before a training session, can actually maximize the adaptations from a training sessions when you're like limited in time. So it's more time efficient training. It's not necessarily better, it's just more time efficient training, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. Actually, it's from my understanding, it's not only about the training volume. It's actually a matter of training stress, right? So you are creating stress in a different way than physical.
Yeah, exactly. So because I'm an exercise physiology, I always like try to look and combine different stimuli. For instance, one of the one stimulus could be like carbohydrate restriction. The other could be like training in the heat. Then the third one would be like training at the altitude. So these are like marginal potential marginal gains when you are like limited in time.
So yeah, that's interesting, and I'm glad that you also mentioned training in heat and at altitude, because that's something that is interesting, because especially in my sport, OCR, like Spartan race, the championships are usually in high altitudes, but not everyone has access to train and go train at high altitudes. But instead, what we can do is simulate to some extent training in high heat. So is this what you use as well?
Yeah, so like I know that like most people think that like altitude training is really beneficial. I think that in certain scenarios it is, but it's not like nothing is magical about it. And one of the things that I also like experimented a bit was training in the heat to induce kind of similar adaptations as altitude training. Um, it's a bit of a complex physiology, so I won't go into details, but it looks like that with prolonged heat exposure, so like 5 weeks of training in the heat, you can actually increase the amount of red blood cells in the body. So this is very similar to what you would expect from hypoxic training, basically, or training at altitude.
Mhm. And I think one of the considerations is that can take athletes by surprise is that the differences in fueling at high altitudes or in high heat. As far as I know, that the carbohydrate requirements go higher, or basically that athlete actually burns more carbohydrates proportionally in high altitudes or in high heat compared to colder environments.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward to answer in terms of the heat, because when it's hot, you basically tend to use more carbohydrates at all intensities. That's pretty well documented. Whereas for the altitude, at the same relative intensity, so let's say I don't know. At the same heart rate, there would be probably no differences in substrate utilization. But because at the altitude, your performance declines, and so does, like, for example, your functional threshold power or your critical speed, whatever, however you define the training zones. as a result of that, at the same absolute intensity, you use more carbohydrates at the altitude. But this is mainly due to the fact that you're training at the higher relative intensity.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's go to some questions that I have from people from the audience, and that was that how would fueling change if we are speaking about training, like strength training. Usually those take about 1 hour, but there are a lot of rests in between sets. And compared to endurance training, if you are running, let's say, 1.5 hour to 2 hours, or on bike, that would be twice that amount. So difference is fueling intra-workout fueling during these strength workouts and in endurance workouts.
So I would probably say that for strength-based workouts, the fueling is not as important during in terms like of carbohydrates, because the energy expenditure during the workout is not as high as during endurance workouts. So in that regard, I usually don't recommend or don't advise athletes to have any carbohydrates for the strength training sessions, whereas for endurance training sessions, yeah, that really depends on the intensity and the duration, as we talked about earlier. But for strength-based training, then it's probably like it's really good that here the protein intake is sufficient. So that's probably the main goal or the main objective you have in mind when designing the nutrition around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And for anybody who is listening, in the show notes there will be a link to article about carbohydrate needs, like during the workout, based on intensity and the length, so they can refer to it. And it brings up actually another question. Like, we are speaking about carbohydrates, right, all the time now. Also, we mentioned a little bit of fat, but what would be the relationship, maybe, of different sources of carbohydrates during the workout, or based on the intensity? So maybe for like low intensity long rides, you might use more complex carbohydrates, or maybe even some fat sources to promote that, also maybe, let's call it, metabolic flexibility. And for higher intensity, probably the sources of carbs would differ.
So, yeah, it's a tough question. So, first of all, let's discuss the fat. I'm never a fan of having fats during exercise, as I see no benefit in that. Because like fat is stored in the body, so you just need to like access it, and the body has the mean to knows how to access the fat. So I wouldn't probably recommend to have any fat during exercise. That it can only like lead to gastrointestinal problems. Whereas when it comes to carbohydrates, I don't think that there is a big difference in terms of metabolism between complex and fast absorbing, let's say, carbohydrates. I usually just say, like, have what you like during training sessions, and the intensity itself will tell you what you can have. So, for instance, I can't imagine having rice cake in the middle of a hard interval, but I can imagine having a gel or a sip from a water bottle. So I would probably like, base my advice on just like whatever you prefer. So if you would probably equate, so basically there is no difference in oxidation rates or ability to oxidize carbohydrates that come from bar, a gel, or a drink, if the amount of fat and fiber is the same. So basically, it doesn't really matter what you have. The most important is that you have enough, basically.
I think the fat and fiber here are the modulators, because the
Yeah.
idea behind that you want more complex carbohydrates, for example, for long endurance session, because long endurance session that takes, let's say, 2 or 3 hours, although it is at low intensity, you release that energy slowly, and that you don't need like high spike of insulin. So this is pretty much the proposition here.
Yeah, I mean, during exercise, you won't see a spike in insulin, so that's something that you shouldn't be no one should be concerned about. Um, I don't really see a big difference. Like, I try different things during exercise. It can actually, like, the only difference would probably be perceptual. So you would feel fuller for longer with a bar as compared to a gel. But in terms of metabolism, I wouldn't really expect big differences.
Right, and that's actually the thing, that the exercise is a good modulator of insulin sensitivity, or let's say how it is, how carbs are processed in our body.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so here is another question actually about the intra-workout nutrition, and it's about actually a cyclist from your audience, and he asks like, he's sweating a lot during the workouts, and so he cannot keep up watts or the effort beyond 1 hour. So what can he actually do to improve his performance, like during these really sweaty sessions?
I mean, my sweat rate, my maximum sweat is like over like 2 hours, 2 liters per hour, which is probably quite kind of a lot. And I don't think this is like a big limitation. What he probably needs to think about is whether he fueled himself enough before the training session. So not just the meal just before the training session, but like, was the breakfast big enough? Was the afternoon um, was the amount of carbohydrates he had the previous afternoon sufficient? And then during the training session, he might want to drink plenty, have carbohydrates in the bottle rather than in a gel, so that he just like gets the energy and the hydration. But yeah, maybe eat some salty foods in the morning if he's training in the afternoon, which will help him to accumulate or store more water in the body for the upcoming training session. But yeah, and he also perhaps he wants to do some sort of a heat acclimation so that he gets adapted to the heat and cope with that feeling of being hot.
Mm-hmm. And just like you said, like with many questions that we are just getting here, or in general from people, there are like very broad questions, and it's hard for us to answer these. We can assume some things, but unless we know the goal of the person, what they have been doing for a certain period of time, it's not only like just mentioned, it's not only about what is happening during that exercise, but what precedes it, and other lifestyle factors, maybe like stress. I actually asked him in the comments, like, is it maybe some changes in his food choices that he made, because it might not be obvious to people, but they start eating healthy, they start eating maybe like more vegetables or whatever, less processed food, so they limit the salt intake, because the main salt intake we have is in the processed foods. So that is something that can make you sweat more. You have less salt now in your body. So yeah, it's very hard to answer based on that like short question.
Yeah, completely agree.
Actually, which is unfortunate. And I think this brings an opportunity for these people who want to get more personal advice and really figure out what it is. Do you have like consultations opportunities for these athletes?
Yeah, so yeah, I currently I'm pretty busy man, as you figured out, but yeah, I'm working together with Tina and a dietetic. We have a dietetic in our team, so yeah, on our website, Human Performance, of the Human Performance Center, they can get in touch and ask for advice, or on my Instagram profile, which is, I guess, pretty famous thing.
Anyway, it will be in the descriptions below. I will put it down there for people to access it easily, unless you don't want to.
Yeah, it's fine. Like I usually like reply to messages, and I always reply to messages on Instagram. So if there is something that I'm also interested in, then yeah, I'm all ears and I'm happy to help.
Yeah, so I think there is one last topic that I would like to just dive into, and that is like post-exercise recovery. So, what would be the considerations to recover the best after a hard training session?
So yeah, that's a really like tough one. So when we think about the recovery process, we think about a few things. So the first obvious thing is that we want to get better. So we see exercise training session as something that we kind of do some damage to the muscle. So we have to repair the muscle in the recovery process. But not just repair it, we want to build new components that are better, more durable, stronger than the ones that were there before. So for that, we need protein. So a high quality protein source is probably one of the most important parts of the recovery period. The next one is also pretty obvious. So during training session, we've used glycogen stores in the body, so in the muscle and in the liver. And from that perspective, we also need to refill those glycogen stores. And this is where things start to become interesting, because we tend to say, yeah, for that we need carbohydrates. But it actually isn't as simple as that. The recent evidence actually points out that you want different types of carbohydrates, which is glucose and fructose based carbohydrates. So glucose based carbohydrates, those are the most abundant form of carbohydrates. So like rice, pasta, maltodextrin, these are all glucose based carbohydrates. And those kinds of carbohydrates are really, really good for replenishing muscle glycogen stores. But they do very little about the liver glycogen stores. So for liver, we want to add some other types of carbohydrates, which is, for example, fructose. So fructose, we get some fructose in the fruits, and we can just get by fructose, and also like table sugar is a really good source of fructose as well. So I usually recommend that for the recovery, for the optimal recovery, you combine different types of carbohydrates. So ideally, you would have something that has a table sugar in it. For instance, like a chocolate milk is a really good example of an optimal recovery drink, or like a Coke or a Fanta with a protein shake on top of that. That works as well, because all those sugary drinks tend to have fructose component in them as well. So
You are crazy talking about table sugar. It's unhealthy.
yeah, I mean, table sugar is not healthy for the teeth, but it's very good for the replenishing of replenishment of the liver glycogen stores. So that's about carbohydrates. And then the third thing, obviously, another obvious one is rehydration. So you want to make sure that you replace all the fluids lost during exercise, but not just fluids. You also have to think about electrolytes. So in that regard, probably some drinks that have some electrolytes, but not just drinks, just like normal foods, eating like pasta, eating a rice cooked in salty water, that could help as well. But like probably the ultimate recovery drink and the one that the most easily accessible one is probably chocolate milk. So chocolate milk is a good source of protein. It's a good source of carbohydrates. It contains 3 different types of carbohydrates. So glucose, it contains galactose, which is a part of lactose, so the milk sugar, and also fructose, because it's like chocolate milk and sugar has been added. So you have all those 3 types of carbohydrates, which should probably effectively replenish both liver and muscle glycogen stores. And then the research has also shown that milk per se is the best hydration drink possible, or rehydration drink possible. So you kind of solve all those issues with a chocolate milk.
And usually also contains some salt inside.
Yeah. So yeah, electrolytes are in the milk as well.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up, for general exerciser, I don't think that they should pay like really special attention to like post-workout meals. Maybe in hot summer months, replenishing especially like water or rehydration, focusing on that. But as you get more and more serious, then you obviously need to start paying more attention to those things and modalities. And what is actually, you mentioned also like proteins, but proteins is something that is usually more spoken about in bodybuilding world or like strength training world, but not as much in endurance world, right? And generally we say that endurance athletes need only about 1.2 grams protein per kilogram, but I have seen also pretty recently some research suggesting that going 1.6 even to 1.8 gram per kilogram of lean body mass is like advantageous. So what's your insight on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the new evidence points out that like serious endurance athletes actually need as much protein or even more as compared to strength-based athletes. And I think Team Sky, now Team Ineos, provided some data from a few years ago showing that their athletes are having like even as much as more than 3 grams per kilogram of body mass of protein per day, which is a huge amount. And like working with athletes, I actually struggle to get the intake lower than 2 grams per kilo of body mass, just because you get protein also in like sources like pasta. This is not a high quality protein, but it's protein nonetheless. So probably those recommendations are a bit outdated. And yeah, I recommend all my athletes to have more than 2 grams per kilo body mass per day.
Yeah, just out of the interest, what would be that 2 grams of kilogram for you percentage wise? Like what percentage of your total calories?
Oh, no idea. Because I never calculated in that way. But yeah, like taking into account that was probably like I usually when I kind of calculate the macronutrients, the first thing that I set into the system, I have a system that calculates the requirements. I feed into the system the amount of protein and an amount of fat. I usually like the amount of fat I usually recommend to athletes is around 1.2 grams per kilo of body mass for those that are happy with the body mass they have. For those that are trying to lose mass, I recommend like 0.8 perhaps. Then protein wise, that would be like 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram body mass per day, and then the rest, which is very variable day to day, like from all the way from 6 to 12 or even more grams per kilogram body mass of carbohydrates. So it's still a pretty small amount, basically, considering the amount of carbs they're getting.
Yeah, but the total protein content is what is interesting here.
I mean, protein can
And
also help with replenishment of muscle glycogen. So if you have more protein,
right.
that's nothing to worry about.
Awesome, Tim. And the very last question, actually, from your colleague, from Tina. And I think it is worth mentioning also, this is like a topic by itself, but maybe we can just very briefly talk about it. Like, how would that fueling for women change for the women compared to men? Especially because women have different stages of their cycle.
So it's kind of really like it's a complex question, and one of the first things that we have to pay attention to is the energy requirements for the training session. So there are some females out there that are as strong as men, and for those I wouldn't see a big difference in terms of amount of carbohydrate they require. But generally, for example, if a guy is riding at 200 watts when on a flat road, a woman would be only riding at like 120 or 150 watts because she's much lighter. Then also this means the energy requirements are lower, so the carbohydrate intake during exercise could be slightly lower. So I usually recommend for strong guys, up to 90 grams per hour of carbohydrates during the training session, and for women, I usually recommend up to 45 grams per hour. But that's just a general rule of thumb. Whereas when it comes to menstrual cycle, the most important, or the only thing that I would really, really pay attention to, and it's worth mentioning, is that in the luteal phase, the release of carbohydrates from the liver is limited during exercise. So for fueling high intensity training sessions, even if they are short ones, like let's say you do an interval training session that is 1 hour long, it's still worth having some carbohydrates around, just because the liver will, for the reasons because of the hormones will not release the glucose into the bloodstream, and that could have an impact on the performance during the training session. So that's really important to consider. But then the other thing is that it's highly individual. So because the hormone levels vary from woman to woman, it's really, really difficult or almost impossible to give one size fits all recommendation. So it has to be very individual. So in that case, I think it's you have to listen to your body and see what works, what doesn't work. But make sure, I think, those pieces of advice that say that you don't need as much carbohydrates in the luteal phase because you're using more fats, and that you might even want to increase fat intake, that's a bit of nonsense, because for fueling high intensity interval training sessions, you need carbohydrates. And if you can't access them from within the body, you need to provide them exogenously, as we say, so from the drink or a bar or something like that.
Yeah, I always enjoy our talks with Tina actually on these topics. So we also have that podcast episode especially for females. And that's basically for it today. And thank you very much for your time, Tim.
No worries.
And links to your account, to Human Performance Center, and to everything that we talked about today will be down in the description, so people can just sign up for or follow you, maybe follow me, sign up for, I don't know, newsletter for the podcast, and anybody who's listening can enjoy this episode, share it around, like it, rate it. It helps to bring people and to speak about interesting topics such as today. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.